Captain Derek Morrison stood in the massive council chamber watching 47 alien species decide humanity's fate. The room stretched higher than any cathedral on Earth, with seats rising in curved rows like an ancient amphitheater. Crystalline, beings sat beside creatures made of pure energy, while others existed as clouds of organized particles. Ambassador Claire Sullivan stood next to Derek with her hands gripping a tablet containing every document humanity had prepared to defend itself. They had been here for 6 months presenting their case and explaining how Earth followed every rule and respected every boundary. Now the waiting was over, and the verdict approached like a storm on the horizon. High Arbiter Zorath rose from his central seat, and his body of liquid metal caught the light from a dozen suns streaming through the transparent dome above. His voice filled the chamber with a sound like distant thunder rolling across mountains. The translation field converted his words into every language spoken in the galaxy, including the English that Derek and Claire understood. What he said made Derek's blood turn cold in his veins. Humanity had been judged a threat to galactic stability. The Council voted to contain Earth and all its colonies because humans advanced too quickly and acted too unpredictably. The word contain sounded gentle, but Derek knew what it really meant. Quarantine, isolation, a slow death as humanity withered behind invisible walls. Claire stood up and her voice stayed steady even though Derek could see her hands shaking. She had negotiated treaties on 6 different worlds and faced down hostile governments without flinching. She asked the High Arbiter what law humanity had broken and what crime they had committed to deserve this punishment. Zorath's metallic form rippled in a gesture that meant dismissal in his species. He explained that humans had broken no written law, but the Council operated on precedent and projection. 3,000 years ago, another species rose quickly, like humanity, and within 2 centuries they had plunged the entire galaxy into devastating war. The Council would not permit history to repeat itself, even if it meant punishing the innocent for crimes they might commit in the future. The chamber erupted in agreement as alien voices blended into a chorus of condemnation. Derek scanned the crowd searching for any ally who might speak in humanity's defense. The Telkari delegation, who had maintained profitable trade relationships with Earth for 20 years, looked away and avoided his eyes. The Kinthari, whose entire species humanity had saved from a plague just 5 years earlier, remained completely silent in their seats. Derek felt his jaw clench as the truth became clear. Humanity was alone and no one would help them. Derek asked when the containment would begin, and his military training kept his voice level and professional. Zorath answered immediately without hesitation or mercy. The quarantine started now, with galactic forces establishing blockades around the solar system within days. No ships would be allowed in or out of human space. The colonies humanity had built beyond the barrier would be relocated, which was another gentle word hiding a brutal reality. The colony on Kepler with 3 million people and the mining operation on Proxima that supported Earth's industrial base would all be lost. Claire's tablet slipped from her fingers and clattered on the polished floor. Derek knew she had grandchildren living on Kepler because she had shown him pictures just yesterday while smiling and talking about her grandson graduating from the Colonial Academy. The High Arbiter continued outlining terms that would strip humanity of everything they had built. Basic technology would be permitted, but advanced systems would be confiscated. Food production would be monitored by Council observers. Military vessels would be decommissioned and destroyed. The timeline was aggressive and comprehensive, and designed to ensure humanity could never threaten the galactic order. Derek thought about his daughter working as an engineer on the Mars terraforming project, and his brother commanding a scientific expedition exploring ancient ruins on Tau Ceti. He thought about billions of humans who had no idea their future was being decided by beings who had never visited Earth and never tried to understand what it meant to be human. The session ended with formal pronouncements and ceremonial declarations. Galactic peacekeepers in powered armor escorted Derek and Claire from the chamber, with professional courtesy that somehow felt worse than open hostility would have felt. In the transport carrying them back to their diplomatic vessel, Claire finally spoke with a voice that sounded hollow and empty. She said humanity had trusted the Council and played by their rules and tried so hard to fit into galactic society. Derek looked out at the vast space station where hundreds of species mingled and traded and built their futures together. Humanity had dreamed of being part of this community and sacrificed so much to prove they belonged. They had adapted their culture and compromised their values and worked tirelessly to be accepted. All of it had meant nothing in the end. Derek told Claire to get him a secure channel to Earth with priority alpha clearance and eyes only for the Security Council. Claire looked at him and recognized the tone in his voice. She had heard it before in younger officers who suddenly aged decades in moments of terrible crisis. She asked what he was going to tell them and what message he would send home. Derek's eyes were hard as steel when he answered. He would tell them the truth without sugarcoating or false hope. Humanity had tried peace and diplomacy and cooperation. The Council had chosen betrayal instead. Now humanity would issue their own order in response. Claire asked what order he meant and what humanity would do next. Derek turned to face her fully, and in his expression she saw something ancient and primal. She saw the survival instinct of a species that had climbed from caves to reach the stars. A species that had survived ice ages and world wars and plagues, and natural disasters that would have destroyed weaker civilizations. She saw the determination of creatures who refused to accept extinction no matter what the universe threw at them. Derek said one word that contained everything humanity would become in the years ahead: survival. They would survive by any means necessary, and the Council would learn that caging humanity was the worst mistake they could have made. The diplomatic vessel left the station and began the long journey back to Earth. Behind them, the Galactic Council celebrated their wise decision to contain a potential threat before it grew dangerous. They believed they had prevented another galactic war and saved countless lives. They had no idea they had just created the very enemy they feared most. They had given humanity time to prepare and motivation to become unstoppable. The Council thought they had written the final chapter of humanity's story among the stars. They were wrong. The story was just beginning, and it would be written in ways they could never imagine. The Situation Room beneath the Swiss Alps had been carved from solid rock during humanity's early space expansion. Admiral Patricia Grant stood at the conference table surrounded by military and civilian leaders of Earth's United Defense Coalition. Holographic displays cast blue light across their faces while Captain Morrison's transmission flickered in the center of the room. He had traveled across light years using quantum entanglement to deliver his report in real time. His voice was steady, but Grant could see exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. Morrison concluded his report by explaining the Council called it quarantine, but everyone should understand this was really a death sentence. The Council would strangle humanity slowly and watch them wither and sleep soundly, believing they had prevented a galactic threat before it could grow dangerous. Secretary General Ramon Diaz slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make the displays flicker. He had built his entire political career on peace and cooperation with alien species. He said the situation was insane because humanity had done everything right and been model citizens of the galaxy. General Frank Carson, who commanded Earth's military forces, said apparently being good citizens was not enough for the Council. They had judged humanity guilty of crimes they had not committed based on actions they had not taken. He had spent 30 years preparing for threats, but never imagined the threat would come from the allies humanity had trusted most. Dr. Lisa Park, who directed the Strategic Research Division, pulled up a star map showing red zones around every human settlement beyond the solar system. She said quietly that the colonies were defenseless against the Council's military superiority in every category. If humanity resisted openly, they would be crushed immediately. If they complied with the quarantine, they would die slowly over generations. Either way, humanity ended. The room fell silent under the weight of that reality. Grant felt every decision made here would echo through history, assuming humanity had a history after this moment. She asked for options and waited while her people processed the impossible situation. General Carson leaned forward and said they should fight back hard and fast. They might not win, but they would make the Council regret underestimating human determination. Diaz countered that open warfare was suicide because the Council had thousands of worlds and billions of soldiers and weapons humanity could barely understand. Carson shot back that doing nothing was also suicide, just slower and more humiliating. Dr. Park cleared her throat and mentioned there might be a third option that no one had considered yet. She explained they had been working on something in the deep research labs called Project Exodus. It had been purely theoretical until now, but given the circumstances, it might be their only hope. Grant raised an eyebrow and told her to explain quickly and clearly. Park said they had been studying ancient technology found on ruins predating the current galactic order. They called the vanished civilization the Architects, and their technology was beyond anything the Council possessed. Humanity had managed to crack some of their systems after years of careful study. Grant asked what kind of systems they had unlocked. Park pulled up schematics that made everyone in the room lean forward with sudden interest. The Architects had built dimensional gateways that could cross vast distances instantly. They had developed weapons that manipulated space-time itself. They had created energy sources that made fusion reactors look like primitive campfires. The Architects had been gods compared to the Council, and they left their technology scattered across the galaxy, waiting to be found by species curious enough to seek it. Carson asked how much of this technology humanity had access to right now. Park answered they had enough to level the playing field, but it was extremely dangerous to use. The Architects had vanished for unknown reasons, and every test suggested their technology operated on principles that could be catastrophic if mishandled. Grant asked dryly if anything could be more catastrophic than extinction. Park met her eyes and said potentially yes, because they were talking about weapons that could crack planets and technology that could tear holes in reality itself. The Architects wielded power on a cosmic scale, and somehow it had destroyed them. Morrison's hologram spoke up from the center of the room. He and Ambassador Sullivan had discussed this extensively during their journey back to Earth. The Council was not just powerful, but complacent after 3,000 years of uninterrupted peace. They had forgotten what real war looked like, and saw humanity as primitives beneath their notice. Diaz asked skeptically if that was supposed to be humanity's advantage. Morrison confirmed that was exactly their advantage, because the Council thought quarantine would contain humanity, and did not expect any resistance. Humanity had a window of maybe weeks before Council forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. If they were going to act, it had to be now. Grant stood and walked to the star map, tracing routes between Earth and its colonies. Humanity had spread so far in just 2 centuries of space exploration. Now they were supposed to just stop and accept their cage. She asked Park how long it would take to weaponize the Architect technology. Park answered 6 months for basic systems and a year for anything truly advanced. Carson said they did not have a year before the Council blockade became permanent. Grant said slowly as an idea formed that they would not weaponize the technology at all. They would do something else that the Council would never expect. Everyone looked at her, waiting for explanation. Grant turned from the map with her decision made. She said they would evacuate every human beyond the solar system and bring them all home. Every colony and every outpost and every ship would return. They would concentrate humanity's entire species within the blockade zone. Diaz protested that this was exactly what the Council wanted them to do. Grant agreed it was what they wanted for now, but that was the point. Humanity would comply publicly and show the Council a defeated contained species. Meanwhile, they would take every scrap of Architect technology they could find and study it and prepare. When they were ready, they would break the quarantine so thoroughly the Council would never be able to cage them again. Morrison understood immediately and said it was a long game where the Council thought they were sealing humanity in, but humanity would use that time to become something the Council could not contain. Grant confirmed that was exactly the plan, but it required sacrifice. Everyone beyond the blockade had to come home with no exceptions. They would lose territory and resources and momentum, but they would keep their people alive, which was all that mattered. The vote was unanimous in less than an hour. Humanity's leadership had made a choice that would define their species for generations. Grant issued the orders personally, and her voice was transmitted to every human settlement in space. She identified herself with full authority and announced Protocol Omega-7. All personnel were to begin immediate evacuation procedures and return to the Sol system by the fastest available route. This was not a drill or an exercise, but an order for the survival of humanity. She paused to let her next words carry their full weight. The Galactic Council had betrayed humanity and sought to cage them and diminish them, and ensure they never rose beyond Council control. Humanity would not allow this. They would endure and adapt and survive. This was not the end of humanity's journey among the stars, but merely a strategic withdrawal. They were not running, but preparing. When they returned, the galaxy would learn what it meant to underestimate humanity. The message rippled across space at light speed, reaching colonies and mining operations, and research stations and deep space explorers. Across hundreds of light years, humanity began to move as one. They were going home, but they would return stronger than ever. The Council had written what they thought was the final chapter, but humanity was about to start writing their own story. The evacuation of Kepler took 8 days that felt like 8 years. Commander Jake Phillips stood on the observation deck of the transport ship, watching the last shuttles lift from the colony surface. Behind him, 3 million people were crammed into vessels designed for cargo and exploration, now repurposed in desperate haste to carry humanity home. Below, the domes of New Seattle glittered in the alien sun. Humanity had spent 15 years building this colony, with terraform processors humming across 3 continents, slowly converting the atmosphere. Agricultural zones produced enough food to feed the population and export surplus. Universities and hospitals and spaceports formed an entire civilization compressed into geodesic structures that had seemed permanent just days. Lieutenant Sam Torres approached and saluted with his uniform still crisp and his face still holding idealism the galaxy had not beaten out of him yet. He reported the final count was 3,200,000 souls, all accounted for. Phillips asked if they had stripped the research facilities of everything valuable. Torres confirmed they took everything portable, including data cores and equipment and samples. They even took the architect artifacts from the dig site in Sector 7. Phillips allowed himself a grim smile because if the Council thought they were hurting frightened refugees, they were in for a surprise. Every colony was not just evacuating but taking everything of value. Knowledge and technology and resources would all return to Earth. When humanity retreated, they retreated with their tools intact. On Proxima, the scene was more chaotic because the mining colony had been purely industrial. 200,000 workers lived underground operating massive machines that carved through rock. Mining Director Helen Zhao coordinated from the control center with screens showing a dozen crisis points simultaneously. Reactor shutdowns and transport scheduling and equipment salvage all demanded her attention. Every decision mattered and every delay cost lives. Her deputy called out with panic in his voice. Reactor 3 would not shut down properly, and if they left it running, it would go critical within 30 hours. If it went critical, it would contaminate half the planet and anyone left behind. Would have maybe 6 hours before radiation. Exposure became fatal. Zhao closed her eyes, knowing they had 80,000 people still underground working to extract the last critical equipment. The evacuation timeline assumed they had 3 more days to finish. Her deputy started to explain they would lose billions in resources if they abandoned the equipment early. Zhao cut him off sharply, saying she did not care if they left behind the crown jewels. She wanted her people out immediately with no arguments and no delays. Lives mattered more than any equipment, regardless of value. The order went out, and workers began flooding to the surface, leaving behind machines worth fortunes. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out with the same desperate urgency. On Tau Ceti, archaeologists abandoned dig sites holding secrets of the architects. On Gliesa, terraforming specialists left atmospheric processors representing decades of work. On dozens of stations and outposts, humans packed what they could and abandoned what they must. The Deep Space Explorer Pathfinder had been 40 light-years from Sol when Admiral Grant's message arrived. Captain Nina Martinez had spent 3 years mapping uncharted regions and discovering 2 potentially habitable worlds. Now she burned back toward Earth at maximum velocity with her crew of 200 scientists cramming months of research into compressed data. Files. Commander Lee Kim approached Martinez with a tablet showing multiple messages from the Zenthori delegation. They were asking if humanity needed assistance with the evacuation. Martinez felt a flicker of hope because the Zenthori had been friendly and treated humans as equals. Kim explained they were offering transport capacity and medical supplies to help ferry colonists. Martinez considered the offer carefully. Accepting help would save time and potentially save lives, but it would also reveal how thin humanity was stretched and show weakness to observers. She politely declined and told Kim to thank them but explain humanity would handle their own evacuation. Kim respectfully pointed out they could actually use the help because some colonies were cutting it close on transport capacity. Martinez knew that, but said the moment they accepted help they showed weakness. The Council was watching for any sign humanity could not survive on their own. They needed the Council to believe the quarantine would work, and that humans were contained and helpless. Only then would they be left alone long enough to prepare their response. Kim nodded slowly, understanding the game they were playing. It was all theater with the compliant evacuation and respectful acknowledgement of council authority. Humanity was playing defeated until the moment came to show their true strength. Back on Earth, Admiral Grant tracked the exodus from the deep command center. Holographic displays showed every human ship and every evacuation convoy and every transport burning toward the solar system. Dr. Park worked beside her, coordinating the influx of architect artifacts. Every colony had been ordered to prioritize ancient technology, and the haul was staggering. Devices and data cores and fragments of structures that predated the Galactic Council by millennia were all coming home. Park reported the Council was watching but not interfering and letting humanity evacuate without resistance. Grant said of course they were not interfering because this was exactly what they wanted, humanity retreating and contained and diminished. They thought they had won without firing a shot. Park asked quietly if they had won. Grant looked at her and said to ask again in 10 years when the real answer would be clear. The last ship to arrive was Morrison's diplomatic vessel, carrying him and Ambassador Sullivan. They landed at Geneva Spaceport 36 days after the evacuation order. Morrison stepped off the shuttle to find Grant waiting personally. She looked older and worn down by weeks of coordinating an interstellar evacuation. Morrison asked for status with no wasted words. Grant answered that every human was inside the solar system now. They had lost 2 ships to mechanical failure with 4,000 souls gone, but everyone else made it home. The Council's blockade fleet arrived 3 days ago and was establishing positions at the heliopause. Humanity was officially quarantined. Morrison asked about the architect technology. Grant confirmed it was secured, and Dr. Park said they had more than she hoped for, enough to change the game completely. They walked through the spaceport, surrounded by the bustle of a species concentrating itself. Ships were being repurposed and resources redistributed, and entire populations finding new homes on worlds they had never seen. Morrison observed they were packed in tight with inner worlds overcrowded and supply lines strained. He asked how long they could sustain this level of crowding. Grant said firmly they would sustain it as long as necessary. Humanity had survived ice ages, and they would survive this. Morrison stopped and looked up at the sky. Somewhere beyond that blue expanse, past the orbits of planets and the edge of the solar system, the Council's warships waited, watching. Confident in their containment, Morrison said quietly the Council was making a mistake. Grant asked what mistake he meant. Morrison said they were giving humanity time to think and time to prepare and time to get angry. They thought they were containing a threat. They did not realize they were creating one. Grant smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. She said good and told Morrison to let them underestimate humanity. It would make what came next all the more satisfying. The Council believed they had solved their human problem. They had no idea they had just given humanity the motivation and time needed to become unstoppable. The quarantine that was supposed to be humanity's tomb would become the forge that made them stronger than the Council could imagine. The next few years would determine whether humanity survived or perished. But one thing was certain. Humanity would not go quietly into extinction. They would fight and adapt and become whatever they needed to be. The Council wanted to write humanity's ending. Instead, they had just written the beginning of something that would shake the galaxy. 5 years passed and the solar system became a fortress. Every asteroid was mined and every resource exploited and every scrap of space utilized. Humanity did not just survive their quarantine, but thrived within it, transforming their cage into a weapon. Dr. Lisa Park stood in the heart of Project Exodus, deep beneath the surface of Ceres. The asteroid had been hollowed out and converted into the largest research facility humanity had ever built. Around her, thousands of scientists worked in clean rooms and quantum laboratories, dissecting the mysteries of the architects. Dr. Alex Chen joined her at the observation window overlooking the primary test chamber. He had aged noticeably, with stress lines around his eyes and his hair more gray than black. 5 years of pushing the boundaries of physics had taken a toll on everyone involved. Chen said they were ready for the test with all safety protocols in place. If this worked the way they thought it would, then everything would change overnight. Park nodded, with her eyes on the device suspended in the chamber below. It looked deceptively simple, like a sphere of dark material covered in patterns that seemed to shift when you were not looking directly at them. Architect technology defied conventional understanding and operated on principles that made quantum mechanics look straightforward. Park ordered them to run the test. Chen activated the device remotely, and for 3 seconds nothing happened. Then the sphere pulsed with light that seemed to come from dimensions the human eye could not properly perceive. Space folded around it, with reality bending like cloth wrapped around a finger. A gateway opened, but not a wormhole or hyperspace corridor. This was something more fundamental. A hole punched through the fabric of space-time itself, connecting 2 distant points with 0 distance between them. Through the gateway they could see stars that should have been light-years away. The test probe on the other side confirmed it by sending signals that arrived instantaneously. Chen whispered that they had done it. Instantaneous travel across any distance meant the Council's blockade just became meaningless. Park allowed herself a moment of triumph before her scientific discipline reasserted itself. She asked how stable the gateway was. Chen answered it was holding steady, with energy consumption high but sustainable. They could keep this open for approximately 6 hours before the device needed to recharge. Park asked about larger versions. Chen explained theoretically they could create gateways large enough for ships or even entire fleets. The energy requirements scaled exponentially, but with the power sources they had developed from other architect artifacts, it was completely feasible. Park opened a communication channel to Admiral Grant. She reported they had confirmation that the gateway technology worked and they could bypass the blockade entirely. Grant's response came immediately, with her voice carrying across the link from Earth. She asked how soon they could scale up production. Park answered, give her 1 year to build production models and 2 years to have enough for full deployment. Grant said they had 18 months, and after that humanity would move whether they were ready or not. While scientists worked on breaking the blockade, the military prepared for what would come after. General Frank Carson oversaw the transformation of humanity's defense forces from a peacekeeping organization into something far more dangerous. On Mars, the Olympus Mons shipyard operated around-the-clock, building vessels that did not look like anything humanity had built before. These were warships incorporating architect technology in their every system. Weapons that could crack moons, shields that bent space itself, engines that treated physics as a suggestion rather than a law. Captain Morrison, promoted to Commodore, stood on the bridge of the first completed vessel called the Defiance. The name was chosen deliberately as a statement of intent. Lieutenant Sam Torres, now his executive officer, ran through the ship's systems. All weapon systems were green. Shield generators operated at 120% of projected capacity. The primary drive showed no anomalies. Morrison ordered a weapons test, with the target being a designated asteroid at full power. The Defiance's primary cannon fired, and the beam that emerged was not laser or plasma, but something that looked like liquid darkness, a stream of energy that operated on principles humanity was still trying to understand. It hit the target asteroid and simply erased it. No explosion, no debris field. The asteroid just stopped existing and was converted to energy in an instant. Torres said quietly that one shot could delete a mountain. The Council's ships would not know what hit them. Morrison said grimly they would learn, and that was the entire point. But not all of humanity's preparation was military. Ambassador Claire Sullivan worked to ensure their species did not lose itself in the quest for survival. She established the Remembrance Initiative as a massive project to preserve human culture and history and values. Every book and every piece of art and every scientific discovery was backed up in quantum storage facilities scattered throughout the solar system. If the worst happened and humanity fell, at least their legacy would remain. More than preservation, Sullivan worked on communication. She prepared messages for the species they would encounter when they broke quarantine, carefully crafted explanations of why humanity chose this path. Late one night, she met with Admiral Grant in the Geneva Command Center. Outside, Earth glittered with lights, and the homeworld was more densely populated than ever, with humanity compressed but unbroken. Sullivan said quietly, they were becoming what the Council feared. The Council judged them a threat, and in response humanity was building weapons that made the Council's nightmares look tame. Grant did not respond immediately because she was tired and worn down by years of preparation, but her resolve had not wavered. Grant finally said the Council created this situation. When they caged humanity and treated them like criminals for the crime of existing, they made this inevitable. Humanity did not choose to be dangerous. The Council forced them to become it. Sullivan asked if they would be able to stop. When they broke the blockade and proved they could not be contained, would they turn these weapons toward peace or conquest? Grant looked at her and said that was why Sullivan was still here. That was why Grant needed voices like hers. To remind humanity what they were fighting for. They were not seeking revenge but demanding the right to exist on their own terms. Sullivan asked what would happen if the council refused to accept that. Grant answered then they would make the council understand that humanity was not something that could be locked away and forgotten. Humanity was not a problem they could solve with quarantine. Humanity was a force of nature, and nature did not ask permission. The months passed with the solar system buzzing with activity as humanity prepared for their return to the galaxy. Ships were built and soldiers trained and technologies tested. Every simulation was run and every contingency planned. On the edge of the system, the Galactic Council's blockade fleet watched. They saw increased activity and noted the energy readings and filed reports that something was happening behind the quarantine, but they did not act because why would they? Humanity was contained and diminished and no longer a concern. The quarantine was working exactly as intended. The council was so confident in their victory, they never saw the hammer being forged behind the cage. When Dr. Park finally declared the gateway technology ready for deployment, Admiral Grant called a final meeting. Every leader and every commander and every person who would play a role in what came next gathered. Morrison was there with his fleet commanders. Torres stood beside him, promoted to captain and given command of his own ship. Park and her team, exhausted but triumphant, held their data pads like treasures. Sullivan represented the diplomatic corps, ready to communicate with a galaxy that might not want to listen. Grant stood at the head of the room, looking at the faces gathered before her. These were the people who had refused to accept extinction, who had taken humanity's darkest hour and transformed it into a crucible that forged something stronger. Grant began by saying 7 years ago the Galactic Council betrayed humanity. They judged humans guilty without trial and dangerous without evidence and sought to cage them like animals. They thought quarantine would be the end of humanity's story. She paused to let the silence build. Then she said they were wrong. The Galactic Council's blockade fleet consisted of 300 warships arrayed in a sphere around the Sol system. Admiral Korvath commanded the fleet from his flagship, with his crystalline body refracting the light of distant stars. He was a veteran of centuries who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. For 7 years his duty had been simple, which was to watch the humans and ensure they stayed contained. It had been the most boring assignment of his long career because humans seemed to have accepted their fate with surprising grace. That assessment lasted until the sensors detected something impossible. The tactical officer reported massive energy signatures from inside the quarantine zone, multiple sources with power levels beyond anything humans should possess. Korvath studied the displays and the readings made no sense. Humans operated on fusion technology which was respectable but limited. These energy signatures suggested something far more advanced. Before Korvath could order analysis, space itself began to tear open. Gateways opened throughout the blockade formation, not in front of the fleet where they could be intercepted, but within it, and behind it and around it. Hundreds of dimensional ruptures bypassed the carefully maintained quarantine as if it did not exist. Through the gateways came the human fleet. The ships were unlike anything the Council had seen humanity build before. They were larger and sleeker and covered in patterns that seemed to shift in ways that hurt to look at directly. They radiated power that made the blockade fleet's weapons look like children's toys. Commodore Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiance as it emerged from the gateway. Around him, 50 warships materialized simultaneously, appearing inside the Council's defensive perimeter with perfect precision. Captain Torres reported from the tactical station that all ships reported successful transit. The Council fleet was attempting to reposition, but they were in complete disarray. They never expected humans to simply appear among them. Morrison ordered all frequencies opened and told them to let the Council hear this. Morrison's voice transmitted to every ship in the Council fleet. He identified himself and said 7 years ago the Council passed judgment on humanity. They declared humans too dangerous to exist freely and too unpredictable to trust. They tried to cage humanity and contain them, and ensure they would never threaten the Council's precious order. Morrison paused, knowing every word was being transmitted across the galaxy and recorded by 1,000 species who had watched humanity's fall. Morrison continued, saying the Council was right to fear humanity, but not for the reasons they thought. The Council feared humans would become conquerors and warmongers and a threat to peace. They never considered that by trying to eliminate the threat they would create it. The Council's betrayal forged humanity into exactly what they feared. The quarantine gave humanity time to evolve beyond Council comprehension. The Council's contempt taught humanity that mercy is weakness in a galaxy that judges by power alone. On the Eternal Justice, Admiral Korvath listened with growing horror. The humans' words were not a plea or a negotiation. They were a declaration of independence. Morrison said this was the Council's single warning. Stand down the blockade. Withdraw from the Sol system. Return to the Council and tell them humanity is no longer asking for permission to exist. Humanity was informing the Council of their independence. Any attempt to reinstate the quarantine would be met with force the Council could not comprehend. Any act of aggression toward human vessels or colonies or interests would be answered with consequences that would echo across the galaxy. Korvath transmitted back, trying to sound authoritative despite the fear crystallizing in his core. He asked what would happen if they refused. Morrison's response was immediate and cold. He ordered the Defiance to target the nearest Council battleship with weapons free. The Defiance fired a single shot with the dark energy beam, crossing the distance between ships in an instant. It struck a Council battleship that had been built to withstand anything conventional weapons could throw at it. The battleship simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there with 300 meters of armor and weapons and crew. The next moment was empty space. Not even debris remained. The Council fleet recoiled in shock as that single demonstration showed them the truth. Humanity had not just escaped their cage. They had transcended it. Morrison said they had 1 hour to withdraw, and after that, humanity would consider their presence an act of war. He told them to choose wisely. On Earth, Admiral Grant watched the feed from the fleet. Ambassador Sullivan stood beside her, and for once the diplomat had nothing to say. They had crossed a line and demonstrated power that would terrify the galaxy, but it was necessary because the Council only understood strength. The Council fleet began to withdraw. Ship by ship they broke formation and retreated beyond the heliopause. Admiral Korvath was among the last to leave, transmitting a final message. He said the Council would hear of this and it was not over. Morrison agreed it was not over, but said it was no longer on the Council's terms. The quarantine was broken. Humanity was free. If the Council wanted to try again, they would learn what it cost to betray humanity. The fleet withdrew completely, leaving human space for the first time in 7 years. Morrison watched them go, feeling the weight of what they had done. He ordered the fleet to set course for Kepler, because it was time to reclaim what was theirs. The human fleet moved out with gateways opening to carry them across distances that should have taken years to traverse. They moved with purpose, reclaiming colonies and re-establishing presence and announcing to the galaxy that humanity had returned. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. High Arbiter Zorath stood before the assembly with his liquid metal form darker than usual. He announced the humans had broken quarantine and possessed technology beyond Council understanding. They had weapons that rendered Council defenses meaningless. They made clear they would not be contained again. The chamber erupted in panic, with some species calling for immediate war and others advocating retreat. Zorath let them argue while watching the careful order he had maintained for centuries crumble. The Council had made a critical error by judging humanity based on potential rather than action, and on fear rather than evidence. In doing so, they created the very threat they sought to prevent. A voice cut through the chaos as Ambassador Sullivan appeared via holographic transmission, standing alone before the assembled might of the galaxy. She said humanity wished to make their position clear. They did not seek war or desire conquest. They wanted only what every species desired, which was the freedom to exist and grow and pursue their own future without fear of arbitrary judgment. A delegate shouted that humanity had demonstrated weapons capable of destroying worlds and asked how they could be trusted. Sullivan met his gaze and said the same question applied to every species in the chamber. They all possessed weapons of mass destruction, and all had the capability to wage war. Yet they coexisted through mutual respect and understood boundaries. Humanity asked only for the same courtesy. She said to judge them by their actions, not their fears. Another delegate demanded to know what would happen if the Council refused and voted to eliminate the human threat permanently. Sullivan's expression hardened, and she said the Council would learn that humanity's capacity for peace was matched only by their capability for war. Humanity spent 7 years preparing for survival. She told them to test humanity, and they would discover the quarantine did not weaken them but made them unstoppable. The chamber fell silent. High Arbiter Zarath asked what humanity proposed. Sullivan said a new treaty based on equality, rather than containment. Humanity would respect council space and law. In return, the council recognizes humanity's right to exist and expand freely. They would establish mutual defense agreements and trade relationships and diplomatic channels. They would become partners rather than prisoners. The council debated for hours, with some species remaining hostile and others advocating for Sullivan's proposal. In the end, pragmatism won because the council had seen what humanity could do. War with humanity would be catastrophic, with no guarantee the council would win. The vote passed narrowly. Humanity would be recognized as a sovereign power with full rights. The quarantine was officially lifted. In exchange, humanity agreed to mutual defense, pacts and trade agreements that would bind them to the Galactic Order through cooperation rather than coercion. When the news reached Earth, the celebrations lasted for days. Admiral Grant watched from her office, allowing herself a rare smile. Morrison raised a glass and said to survival. Grant corrected him and said to more than survival. To proving humanity cannot be contained or diminished or judged by fear alone. They were betrayed and responded not with revenge but with determination. They became what they needed to be to survive. Morrison asked if the council would ever trust them. Grant looked out at Earth and at the ships beginning to leave for the colonies. She said trust is earned through time and action. Humanity would show them day by day they were not the threat imagined. But humanity would never forget what the council tried to do. That memory would keep them strong and vigilant and free. Ambassador Sullivan joined them, looking exhausted but satisfied. The Xanthori delegation sent a message wanting to establish formal diplomatic relations.